There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another episode of In Other Words, which is an occasional series where I talk about interesting vocabulary, idioms, occasionally grammatical patterns that I encounter in my reading. So I have another half dozen or so to tell you about today, and I also want to tell you, those of you that like this sort of video, a subscriber asked me how he could find previous episodes easily, and I thought, well, search for Book Maniac. In other words, they should come up. But actually, recently, the YouTube, there's something weird about the YouTube search function. It just doesn't work as well as it used to. So I have created a playlist. All of the episodes past and in the future will be on that playlist, so you can access them easily if you want. Okay. I should also say I am not an expert in these matters. I'm an English teacher. I love words. I love reading, but I just look this stuff up online. There's a whole bunch of online etymology and word origin sites, and I have a good time going down the rabbit holes. But often the most interesting stuff about these videos is what happens in the comment section, where people will correct me or add more information and so on. So do check out the comment section as well. Okay, let's get started. The first couple come from an Australian novel, and I actually do have a physical copy. It's a beautiful physical book, but I couldn't find it, and didn't want to spend 20 minutes looking for it when I'm just going to hold it up for 5 seconds. So here is the GIF. It is a 1970s novel by Gerald Murnane, Tamarisk Row. I have a review of that. I'll put the link in the show notes. The two words that are from there are not particularly Australian English terms, but both are kind of geographical. The first one is the phrase lee side. Something or other was described as being located on the lee side of the very last tamarisk. So I didn't know what that meant, and here's what it means. It means the sheltered side of something, the side away from the wind. For example, ducks were taking shelter on the lee side of the island. The word lee itself can be used to mean shelter from wind or weather given by an object. He went round the front of the cab to be out of the wind and lit a cigarette in its lee. So that's what lee means, and the opposite is windward. Who knew we needed a word like that, but which is the direction upwind from a point of reference, or the direction from which the wind is coming. So I should say that is the adverb, and the adverb for lee is leeward. So windward and leeward. So let's talk about lee. It came into Middle English from Old English, and I don't know how to pronounce any of those words, but the original Old English haleo meant shelter, cover, defense, protection from Proto-Germanic. It also, at that time, went into Old Norse and Danish and Old Saxon and Dutch. They're not sure the original sense, but it might have meant warm. There's a word in German, lau, which means tepid. And in Old Norse, another word similar that means shelter and warmth. But it has been traced back to the Proto-Indo-European root kele. Here's the spelling. We will talk about that Proto-Indo-European root in just a sec. But in terms of the whole idea about the wind, it was a nautical word. That part of the hemisphere to which the wind is directed, that entered English around 1400, Scandinavian in origin. And the idea, the notion of it is that the side of the ship opposite that which receives the wind is the sheltered side. And it became an adjective in the early 16th century that came from the noun lee. In addition to the idea of the lee side was the lee shore, the shore toward which the wind blows. You may have already thought of this on your own. Leeway, that is a word we use in English, which means kind of a flexibility, extra space, but originally leeway meant the sideways drift of a ship in her course caused by wind, deviation from the true course, drifting to leeward. Leeway, that was the original meaning in English from about the mid-17th century. By the early 19th century, leeway meant loss of progress in general. And modern, we use it to mean we have some flexibility, some extra room to decide something interesting. So now let's talk about the Proto-Indo-European root, which of course I don't know how to pronounce. Kele. The root means warm, and it is the root for these words: calorie, cauldron, chafe, chowder, caudle, lee, lukewarm, nonchalant, not hot, nonchalant, scald. That's fascinating. There is a bit of a connection to the word weather, but it's a little bit tenuous, so I'm not going to take the time. But weather goes back to, they think it's kind of a kissing cousin from the same root, or a cousin of the root. But lukewarm interests me. Of course, it means neither hot or cold. But luke, meaning tepid, came into English around 1200. But they have traced it back to that Proto-Germanic root, which goes back to the same Proto-Indo-European root. So interesting. And also furlong. I'd heard the word. I didn't really know what it meant. I don't even know if I completely understood it to be a unit of measurement. But it's an eighth of a mile, 220 yards if you're still thinking in the imperial system. So it comes from furrow plus long. It originally described the length of a furrow in a common field, which I guess the formula or the idea of the size of that was the square of 10 acres. That makes my eyes glaze over. It was also used as the equivalent of a Roman stadium, 1/8 of a Roman mile. That's where it comes from. So stadium actually is etymologically connected. We had it in Middle English, we had it in Old English, back to Proto-Germanic, Middle Dutch, Dutch, German, Old Norse. And it goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root perk. Now, perk is one of those roots that I couldn't find research about other things that derived from that root, unfortunately. But regardless, that's the Proto-Indo-European root. So furrow also took the the original meaning in English from the early 15th century, to plow, to make furrows in, from the noun. A trench in the earth made by a plow. The more recent meaning, it's not that recent, from the late 16th century, is to make wrinkles in one's face or brow. So the furrowed brow. I'm so young I can't do it. So that's what I know about that. I am reading this anthology of British short stories 1890 to 1914. The Golden Age of the British Short Story, edited by Philip Hensher. Buddy read with Joe Smith, and there were a couple from an H.G. Wells story. The story was The Argonauts of the Air. I didn't particularly care for the story. It was okay, but just okay. But a couple words from that. The first one was palled. The character, I don't remember if this is the main character or whatever, but Monson found a certain satisfaction in going on the works and behaving disagreeably to as many people as possible. I think the works was the place where people were building an airplane, maybe. After a time, even that palled upon him. Palled. I had a vague idea of what it meant, but you probably know already that it means something becomes tiresome or insipid. It's been in the language since the year 1700. They think that it derives from the original pall, which means to become faint or to fail in strength. This meaning of pall, to become tiresome or insipid, we had it in Middle English, and the OED calls it a shortened form of appallen, which means to dismay, fill with horror or disgust. So you're already probably thinking of the verb appall. It's appalling. It appalled me. Appall is older than pall. So appall has been around in English since the early 14th century, meaning to fade, to grow pale. And it came to us from Old French, and going back to Latin, pallere, and goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root pell, the transitive meaning to cause dismay or shock, from the 1530s. And the tiresome, insipid meaning a couple centuries later. So it's made by putting the word-forming element, that's what the etymological dictionaries call add. Here's add. I would call it a prefix, meaning expressing direction toward or in addition to. Plus pallier, so appall comes from that. So I'm not going to spend any time on add, but let's go directly to the Proto-Indo-European root. Pall, meaning pale. So it is the root of a bunch of other interesting words. Falcon. Why? I don't know why. Are falcons, do they have a white breast? Would that be, let's look at that. Is that why? Yeah, gray. I guess so. I guess they're gray. That's, you learn something new every day. Fallow. Fauvest. The name Lloyd. We've talked about pale. Pallid. Pallor. Palomino. The ancient city Peloponnesus. Is it a city or a god? I've forgotten. Polio. So there you go. And the other phrase, and I won't bother looking up the sentence, is a phrase that most of us have heard, and I have heard, run amok. It was spelled this way in the story. It can also be spelled this way. I'll put them both on the screen for a minute. Run amok, two spellings. And in modern parlance, it means, like, for example, children messing up, making a mess while they run around and play, kind of a chaos. But that is a very modern meaning. It had quite a different meaning. Back in the old times, it meant to go postal, where you just snap and go on a rampage. That's the original meaning of run amok. And it entered English in the late 17th century, and it comes from the Malay language, or Austronesian language. Amuck in that language meant to attack furiously. And other meanings in Portuguese meant a frenzied Malay, like a person from this part of the world that was kind of crazy. Amuck, but it goes back to their own language. But yeah, we now say go postal, and that was the original meaning. It was a very violent thing, and it actually shows up in the DSM as a syndrome, amuck syndrome. I don't know how old, if that's still in there, but the whole DSM should be thrown in the trash, if you ask me. But it is the name of a mental disorder, amuck disorder. Apparently, there was a specific type of sociopathic behavior in the cultures of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei. I don't know how colonialist or racist this is, if anybody has any more information about it, but typical cases, we're talking back in the colonial era, so several cups of salt to take with this explanation that's in Wikipedia. A man would not have shown any signs of any anger or any problems, would get a weapon, usually a sword or a dagger, and then in a sudden frenzy attempt to kill a whole bunch of people just around him at random. I read for the Book Naturalist Club that Doris of Aldi Books and Heidi of My Reading Life are sponsoring, putting on this year. I read a great work of non-fiction about nature, World of Wonders, by Amy Nezekuma-Tattle. It's got a longer title. We had a Zoom chat with my mom. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. To close, a couple of words from that book. The first one is riprap. And riprap is a barrier of stones that prevents erosion along a river or other body of water. So why is it called riprap? Here are some pictures of it. It actually started in American English, 1822. There was an earlier nautical word riprap that meant a stretch of rippling water in British English from the mid-17th century. But the American 1822 thing, it was, like I say, it connected it to the earlier nautical word, meaning a stretch of rippling water. Rap, of course, also means to blow, or a blow or a strike. So this idea of the waves striking the rocks, I think that's part of where it comes from. But also that those rocks cause a stretch of rippling water, so the rip and the rap. It's kind of obscure, nobody knows for sure. In modern English, it is used in three very closely related ways. Riprap is a loose stone that's used to make the foundation for the breakwater. It's also material with which to armor or protect shorelines, stream beds, bridge abutments, pilings, and other shoreline structures. And it's also used, riprap, to just mean the foundation or sustaining wall of such stones. And the last one, also from the Nezhukumatatle. Took me forever to learn how to pronounce her name, so I want to use it whenever I can, just to show off, is pinnation. And pinnation is much more easily explained by a bunch of pictures. It was a new word to me, and it's not a common word, it's a botany word. And it can be spelled pinnation with an I or pennation with an E. It's the arrangement of feather-like or multi-divided features arising from both sides of a common axis. So these pictures of leaves will show it. We find it in crystals, find it in patterns of erosion, but of course we find it in plants themselves. It comes from the Latin word pinna, which meant feather, wing, or fin. There is also an adjective pinnate, shaped like a feather, and these words go back, like I say, to the Latin pinna or pinnatus, and that goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root, pet, which means to rush or to fly. So that's fascinating, and here are a bunch of words that are related to, go back to the same pet root. Appetite. I wonder why. Appetite. Centripetal. Compete. Compete I can see. Competent. Feather. Helicopter. Hippopotamus. I don't think hippopotamuses are really fast, aren't they? Impetigo. Impetuous. Impetus. Panache. Pen. Feather pen. Oh, interesting. Writing implement. Peripeteia. Perpetual. Perpetuity. Petition. Petulance. Pin. I wonder why pin. Pinnacle. Propitious. Pterodactyl. Remember there's a P there, P-T-E. Repeat and symptom. Well, that is fascinating. That's what I got for this time. Thanks for watching.